Welcome to Davy the Goat's Stories. If you like what you hear, feel free to comment story recommendations and feedback. Now sit back, grab your popcorn and enjoy.
The Millers were, on the surface, the quintessential American family. Dad, Tom, worked in finance, Mom, Sarah, was a stay-at-home mom, and their two kids, 16-year-old Emily and 10-year-old Billy, filled the house with the chaotic energy of youth. They lived in a large, two-story colonial in a quiet, tree-lined suburb of Minneapolis, the kind of place where nothing ever happens. Except, something was happening in the Miller house. Something in the attic. Emily was the first to notice. It started subtly. Faint scratching sounds at night, like a rodent scrabbling in the walls. She dismissed it at first. Old houses make noises. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent. Then came the low, guttural growls, almost like an animal clearing its throat. "Mom, I think there's something in the attic," she'd told Sarah one afternoon, while helping her prepare dinner. Sarah, preoccupied with chopping vegetables and the bubbling tomato sauce on the stove, just smiled dismissively. "Oh, Emily, probably just squirrels. Your father will call an exterminator next week." But Emily knew it wasn't squirrels. Squirrels didn't growl. The sounds escalated over the next few weeks. They were no longer confined to the night. Emily would hear them during the day, a cacophony of scraping, dragging, and low, menacing rumbles. She started to avoid the hallway that led to the attic stairs, a cold dread settling in her stomach every time she passed it. One Tuesday, during a particularly fierce thunderstorm, the power went out. Tom was still at work, and Billy was engrossed in a video game on his tablet. Emily, bored and restless, found herself drawn to the attic stairs. The house was plunged into an eerie darkness, the only light filtering in through the rain-streaked windows. The storm raged outside, mimicking the turmoil in her heart. As she placed her foot on the first step, she heard it again, a long, drawn-out growl, closer this time, laced with a hunger that made her blood run cold. She froze, her hand gripping the banister, heart hammering against her ribs. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the thunder. Silence. Then, a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like claws dragging across wood. Emily backed away, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't wait to hear more. She sprinted back downstairs, slamming the attic door shut with a frantic energy. She tried to tell her family. She told Tom about the noises, about the feeling of being watched, about the sheer terror that gripped her whenever she was near the attic. Tom, a practical man grounded in logic and reason, brushed it off. "Emily, honey, you're letting your imagination run wild. It's just an old house settling. I'll check it out this weekend." That weekend never came. Friday night, Emily woke to a piercing scream. It was Sarah. She jolted upright in bed, her heart leaping into her throat. Another scream, this one choked off mid-air. Emily threw back the covers and ran towards her parents' room, Billy trailing behind her, wide-eyed with fear. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. Emily pushed it open. The scene inside was a nightmare made real. Tom lay sprawled on the floor, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. Sarah was slumped against the headboard, her eyes wide and vacant, a crimson stain blooming across her chest. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood. And then Emily saw it. Standing in the corner of the room, shrouded in shadow, was a hulking silhouette. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but impossibly large, its form contorted and grotesque. Two glowing red eyes burned into Emily's soul, radiating pure, malevolent intent. It let out a low, guttural snarl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house. Panic seized Emily. She grabbed Billy's hand and dragged him from the room, screaming, "Run! Run!" They fled downstairs, out the front door, and into the rain-soaked street. They ran until they reached Mrs. Henderson's house across the street, pounding on the door until the elderly woman, bleary-eyed and confused, let them in. The police arrived quickly, sirens wailing, the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the dark street. The scene they found in the Miller house was horrific. Tom and Sarah were dead, their bodies savagely mutilated. But there was no sign of an intruder, no forced entry, no evidence of anything unnatural. The consensus was that it was a home invasion gone wrong. A story all too familiar in the modern age. Except, Emily knew it wasn't. She tried to tell the police about the creature in the attic, about the glowing red eyes, about the terrifying growls. But they just exchanged worried glances, their expressions tinged with pity and disbelief. "She's in shock," she heard one of the officers whisper. "Poor kid." Billy, traumatized by what he had witnessed, couldn't corroborate Emily's story. He was withdrawn, silent, and whenever Emily tried to talk about the monster, he would burst into tears. He was just a child, and the memory of his parents' brutal deaths was too much for him to bear. Emily was alone. The social workers arranged for Emily and Billy to live with their aunt, Tom's sister, in another state. Trying to start fresh. But Emily knew she could never escape the memory of what she had seen. The image of those glowing red eyes was burned into her mind, a constant reminder of the horror that lurked in her old home. Years passed. Billy eventually recovered, or at least learned to cope with the trauma. He went to college, got married, and started a family of his own. He never spoke of that night, and Emily never pressed him. But Emily remained haunted. She became obsessed with the supernatural, devouring books on folklore, mythology, and paranormal phenomena. She researched creatures that dwelled in shadows, monsters that fed on fear. She became convinced that the thing in her attic was not unique, that it was part of a larger, unseen world of horrors that existed just beyond the veil of reality. She tried to warn people, to tell them about the dangers that lurked in the dark. But no one believed her. They saw her as a disturbed woman, a tragic victim of a horrific crime. She became known as the crazy lady who believed in monsters. One day, years later, Emily decided to return to Minneapolis. She drove back to her old neighborhood, the familiar streets and houses triggering a flood of memories, both good and bad. She parked in front of her old house, the house where her family had been murdered. The house stood empty and derelict. The windows were boarded up, the paint was peeling, and the lawn was overgrown with weeds. It looked like a haunted house, frozen in time. Taking a deep breath, Emily got out of the car and walked towards the house. The front door was unlocked, the wood rotting and splintered. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was silent, filled with the musty smell of decay and the ghostly echoes of the past. Emily walked through the empty rooms, her heart pounding in her chest. She could almost hear the laughter of her family, the clatter of dishes, the comforting sounds of a life that was now gone. She reached the hallway that led to the attic stairs. The door was still there, a simple wooden panel that stood between her and the source of her nightmares. She placed her hand on the doorknob, hesitating for a moment. Should she do this? Was she strong enough to face what was waiting for her? Taking another deep breath, she twisted the knob and pulled the door open. The stairs leading up to the attic were dark and steep, disappearing into the inky blackness above. Emily took a tentative step, then another, her hand gripping the railing for support. As she climbed the stairs, she heard it again, a faint scratching sound, like claws dragging across wood. Her blood ran cold. It was still there. She reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the attic. The air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Moonlight streamed through cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Emily scanned the attic, her eyes darting from corner to corner. It was empty. Or so she thought. Then, she saw it. Lurking in the far corner of the attic, hidden in the deepest shadows, were two glowing red eyes. They were watching her, waiting. A low, guttural snarl echoed through the attic, filling the room with a palpable sense of dread. The monster was still there. And it was waiting for her. Emily knew, in that moment, that she was not crazy. She had been right all along. And now, she was face to face with the horror that had destroyed her life. She had come back to confront it, to prove to herself that she wasn't insane. But had she made a fatal mistake? The story ends there, with Emily standing in the attic, staring into the glowing red eyes of the monster. Whether she survives or becomes another victim remains a mystery, but one thing is certain: the monster in the attic is real, and it's still out there, waiting in the shadows. And no one will ever believe her, even in the end.
Thank you all for sticking around till the end. Feel free to like and subscribe, leave a comment on what other stories you want me to write about. Davey the Goat out.